The rain fell in thin, steady lines on the pavement of Fifth Avenue, softening the roar of traffic and casting a faint shimmer over the sidewalks of Midtown Manhattan. It was a Tuesday evening in October 2012, and St. Patrick's Cathedral stood silent and radiant under the grey, weeping sky. Inside its Gothic walls, candles flickered like distant stars, echoing off the stone and stained glass in a warm, holy hush. Thomas Harland, a 64-year-old Vietnam veteran, paused at the cathedral's massive front doors. He wiped the water from his brow, adjusted the hood of his army surplus coat and stepped inside. The rush of city noise vanished behind him like a wave closing over a diver. The cathedral embraced him with solemn quiet and the faint scent of incense and wax. To those who knew him, Thomas was a man of routine, diligent, modest, and quietly spiritual. Every Tuesday after his volunteer shift at the VA hospital, he came here. He lit a candle, said a prayer for his son Michael, who had died in Iraq 7 years prior, and then sat silently in one of the rear pews, fingers looping over the worn beads of his father's rosary. The same rosary he'd carried through the jungles of Da Nang, the same one his wife Eleanor said he touched in his sleep, but on that evening Thomas looked different. His gait was slower, his shoulders hunched deeper than usual. As he entered, he lingered by the holy water font longer than he ever had, pressing his fingertips to his forehead, chest, shoulders with solemn deliberation. He walked down the side aisle, bypassing the usual pew, and instead approached the altar of the Pietà, near the right transept. There he knelt, not to pray immediately but to stare. A priest later said he seemed transfixed, murmuring something under his breath, rosary beads trembling in his hands. Another visitor recalled hearing him whisper, "If you're listening, just show me." But no one could be certain. The visitors came and went. The candles burned down. And when the cathedral closed its doors at 9 p.m., the old man was no longer there. That night, Eleanor Harland waited with a cup of tea slowly cooling in her hands. Thomas was never late. He was the kind of man who called when the subway stalled. When midnight arrived with no word, her anxiety crystallized into dread. By morning, she called the police. The initial response was procedural, even dismissive. Adults disappear all the time, especially in a city as vast and volatile as New York. Maybe he had wandered off. Maybe he'd suffered a medical episode. Maybe he'd simply chosen not to return. But Thomas was not the kind of man who vanished. He had lived his entire life with quiet duty, raising his daughter Katie with firm gentleness, nursing Eleanor through 2 battles with cancer, and never once, not once, breaking his routines. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He didn't keep secrets. Katie flew in from Chicago the next morning. By then, the NYPD had reviewed nearby surveillance footage, cameras outside St. Patrick's captured Thomas entering at 7:12 p.m., hood down, head lowered. But not a single angle showed him exiting. No one saw him leave. No one reported speaking with him. It was as though the cathedral had swallowed him whole. Detectives interviewed the clergy, volunteers, and tourists who had been present that evening. No one recalled anything unusual. Our custodian mentioned a flicker in the lights near the transept, like a surge, but couldn't tie it to anything. A group of nuns recalled the old man praying deeply near the Pietà, but couldn't pinpoint when he'd disappeared. Then came the oddest discovery. One of the internal security feeds, stationed above the north aisle, had failed at 7:26 p.m. The file was corrupted, its footage lost. A rare glitch, they said. No one could explain it. Within 48 hours, Thomas Harland's face was on every lamppost in Midtown. Flyers, phone calls, news segments, but the trail ended at the cathedral's grand entrance. A man had walked in to speak with God and never walked out. If stories like this grip your heart and pull you deeper into the mysteries that surround us, don't forget to subscribe. We uncover the truths that time forgot and those it buried. What happened to Thomas Harland inside St. Patrick's Cathedral that night? A disappearance in plain sight, wrapped in prayer and silence. But this was only the beginning. Because 13 years later, something would be found, something that should never have survived. The morning after Thomas Harland disappeared, the world kept spinning as if nothing had happened. But inside the Harland home, Time had stopped. Eleanor sat by the phone, her hands trembling, replaying the same thought over and over. He wouldn't just leave. By 9 a.m. she called the NYPD again. The officer at the precinct assured her they'd checked the hospitals. Could have collapsed somewhere, he said, trying to sound reassuring. But Eleanor knew better. She knew her husband's habits, his meticulous nature, his punctuality, his unwavering devotion to her, to their daughter, to God. Something was deeply wrong. Katie arrived at LaGuardia by noon, barely speaking on the cab ride over. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her hands clenched around her phone. She had already called St. Patrick's twice. Both times she was told her father had come in and not been seen leaving. That was it. They filed a missing person report together that afternoon. The detective assigned to the case, Luis Marquez, seemed kind but skeptical. He'd seen hundreds of missing person reports. Most of the time, he said gently, people show up within 48 hours. But Thomas didn't. The family began calling local hospitals and shelters on their own. They walked the blocks surrounding the cathedral, handing out flyers and asking doormen, shopkeepers, even homeless men on the sidewalk. No one had seen him. No one remembered his face. He had vanished without sound, without trace. Katie returned to the cathedral that evening. The air inside felt different, thicker somehow, as if holding its breath. She sat in the exact pew where her father used to pray and stared at the Pietà. The marble looked colder than before, Mary's expression more mournful. She whispered, "Please, just help me find him." Her voice echoed into the silence. Detective Marquez reviewed surveillance again. Cameras from nearby stores showed Thomas walking toward the cathedral. Inside, the cathedral's main entrance feed showed him entering, slowing as he stepped into the vestibule. Then, nothing. The last confirmed sighting. The angle that might have caught him exiting was exactly the one that had glitched, just as Thomas had disappeared. That anomaly changed the tone of the investigation. Detectives canvassed the cathedral. They interviewed the priests, the staff, even members of the choir. None had spoken to Thomas. None had seen anything strange. No sudden illness, no confusion, no signs of struggle. Just another old man who came to pray. But Eleanor was inconsolable. He didn't run, he didn't fall, he didn't forget his way. Something happened inside that church. Katie, once a marketing manager used to campaigns and boardrooms, was now poring over blueprints of the cathedral, searching for anything. A side exit, a trap door, a storage closet that might have been overlooked. She printed out the surveillance still of her father entering the cathedral and tacked it to the wall of her childhood bedroom. She stared at it as if he might move, wave, return. In those first 48 hours, the media wasn't interested. The police followed protocol, and everyone expected that this would end the way most disappearances do, with a phone call, a tip, a sudden reappearance. But there was no phone call, no sighting, no clues, just the echo of Thomas's last steps and the gnawing silence that followed. On the second night, Eleanor dreamed she was sitting in the pew beside her husband. He was praying, lips moving, but no sound came out. When she reached to touch his hand, he vanished. She woke up screaming. Katie stayed up late that night, watching old family videos, Thomas laughing at a picnic. Thomas singing an off-key version of Silent Night. Thomas lifting her up in the air when she was small. That man didn't just walk away. By the end of the second day, something in Katie had hardened. Her voice was no longer trembling. It was sharp, urgent. She called Marquez again and told him, "You're not looking in the right places. But where do you look when someone disappears in a church surrounded by hundreds of people and no one sees a thing?" As night fell on the second day, the only thing the Harlans had was a photograph, a prayer, and a growing sense that something more was at play. The cathedral, once a place of comfort, now felt like a locked room full of secrets, and Thomas Harland was still nowhere to be found. 3 days after Thomas Harland vanished, the narrative began to shift. The initial sympathy from law enforcement gave way to skepticism. With no ransom note, no witness testimony, and no forensic evidence of a crime, Detective Marquez started asking harder questions, not just about the disappearance, but about the man himself. Could he have left willingly, he asked Katie during their third meeting. Was he depressed, hiding something, looking for escape? Katie bristled. My father didn't run. He wasn't a man who disappeared. He was solid, anchored. He didn't even skip doctor's appointments. Still, the questions came. Had he argued with anyone recently? Was there money missing? Any history of mental illness? When was the last time he'd expressed dissatisfaction with his life? The idea that her father had orchestrated his own disappearance was insulting, but without answers, theories began to take root. Some believed Thomas had suffered a breakdown. Others suggested he may have experienced memory loss and wandered off. A few cruel voices online speculated that he'd simply abandoned his family. Eleanor refused to engage with any of it. She stopped answering calls from the press and ignored neighbors who offered hollow condolences. She clung to her faith like a shield, attending Mass twice a day, praying longer, more fervently than ever. Katie, on the other hand, turned outward. She built a small website, posted photos, created timelines. She distributed flyers outside the cathedral every afternoon. Some passers-by took them politely. Some asked questions. A few recoiled when she said her father vanished inside a church. It wasn't just the silence that was unsettling. It was the location. Something about disappearing in a cathedral felt more than unusual. It felt otherworldly. The architecture of St. Patrick's, once majestic and calming, now loomed like a labyrinth. Every arch, every shadow seemed to hold secrets. Katie began researching similar cases. Disappearances in public spaces, vanishings with no witnesses. She expected to find patterns in parking lots or wooded trails, but cathedrals. Then one morning she overheard something in the cathedral vestibule that made her stop cold. Two elderly women were whispering by the votive candles. One said she felt a cold patch near the Pietà. The other nodded. It's been like that since the old man vanished. Sometimes I hear breathing too. Katie approached them gently, asking what they meant. The women hesitated, reluctant to speak too openly. We don't want to stir things, one said, but sometimes after sundown, it feels off. She began collecting these stories quietly, methodically. A custodian claimed that some lights near the transept flickered unpredictably. A young sacristan confessed to avoiding late shifts because he heard footsteps in empty aisles. A choir member said she once felt her sleeve tugged during practice, only to turn and find no one there. Was it superstition? Coincidence? Katie didn't know, but she felt it too. The air near the Pietà had weight to it now, a pressure like being watched. She didn't want to believe in ghosts or miracles. But she was no longer certain disbelief was safer. She kept a notebook with her everywhere. Inside were hand-drawn maps of the cathedral, notes on every reported anomaly, and a growing list of people willing to talk, off the record, after hours. One night, she spoke with Father Abel, an elderly priest who had served at St. Patrick's for more than 40 years. His voice was low, hesitant. There are things we don't understand, he said, eyes fixed on the altar. I've seen people come to this place with burdens too great to carry. Some leave lighter, some never leave at all. Katie pressed him. Had anything like this happened before? Father Abel paused, then offered a cryptic response. He came seeking something. Sometimes the seeking is more dangerous than the finding. As days turned into weeks, the investigation dwindled. The police had no leads. The press had moved on. But Katie was just beginning. Her father hadn't left them. Something had happened. Something strange, something sacred, something hidden. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged, alive. And Katie was ready to listen. Katie Harlan's instincts told her something about her father's disappearance was larger than anyone realized. And if the cathedral wouldn't yield its secrets easily, she would dig elsewhere. She began with history, records, archives, old newsreels. She wanted to know if St. Patrick's had ever been the site of anything strange. She didn't expect what she found. In a dim corner of the Public Records Library on 42nd Street, she uncovered a microfilm article from 1932. Headline: Young Novice Fails to Return from Meditation at Cathedral. The story detailed a 22-year-old man, Francis Doyle, who was last seen entering St. Patrick's for private prayer. No evidence of foul play, no trace ever found. His family claimed he had devoted himself too fully to silence. 2 decades later, another article dated 1956. This time, a widowed seamstress named Delia Mendez, who had worked in Midtown, disappeared after attending evening mass. The last confirmed sighting. She was lighting a candle near the statue of St. Jude. Her purse was found under the pew, untouched. Neither case was ever solved. Katie sat motionless, the fluorescent light buzzing above her. 2 people lost decades apart, inside the same cathedral. Same silence, same absence of witnesses. No one had ever connected them, not publicly. She dug deeper. A few of the older articles referenced maintenance disruptions, unexplained damage to floors or sealed stairwells. She found building renovation permits from the 1970s that listed restricted access to lower chamber beneath sanctuary. But there were no blueprints, no diagrams. It was as if a part of the cathedral's layout had been scrubbed clean. Her next stop was the Archdiocese Records Office. She didn't expect access, but she got lucky. A young archivist, moved by the story of her missing father, agreed to let her review select non-confidential files. That's where she found it. An old maintenance report, unsigned, dated 1954, describing unusual drafts and echo resonance beneath the altar floor. A note scribbled in the margin read, "Secondary space may exist behind original foundation tiles. Do not disturb." Katie's pulse quickened. If there was a hidden chamber, or some structure lost to time, could it have anything to do with the people who'd vanished? She returned to the cathedral the next day, this time with a laser focus. She traced every corner with her eyes, noting the incongruences in stonework, the differences in floor pattern symmetry. She found herself drawn again to the right transept, where the Pietà stood like an eternal sentinel. That's when she met Walter, a long-time custodian with a skeptical smile and slow gait. When she asked if he knew anything about older parts of the building, he raised an eyebrow. "There's a lot under these stones," he said. "They say the cathedral's like an onion. Peel 1 layer, find 10 more." Katie asked him directly, "Was there a sealed room beneath the altar?" Walter scratched his chin, then lowered his voice. "There's places we don't clean. Places we're told not to go. All I know is, when I was young, a guy tried opening something behind the Pietà tile. Next week he quit and never came back." That night, Katie returned with a small digital recorder. She placed it behind the column nearest the Pietà, facing the altar, and let it run while she sat in silent vigil. After 2 hours, she retrieved it and listened back at home. Most of it was nothing, rustling, footsteps, whispered prayers. But at 1 hour and 58 minutes, she heard something strange. A low breath, then a faint shuffling, and a voice, barely audible, murmuring something that made her stomach clench. It said, "Still here." Katie played it again and again. Each time it chilled her deeper. She uploaded the clip to a private forum for audio engineers and asked for opinions. One response stood out. "That doesn't sound like reverb, sounds like someone real, someone trapped." By now she couldn't sleep. The pieces were coming together. Disappearances, hidden chambers, sounds where there should be none. Her father's case wasn't isolated. Something inside St. Patrick's had been waiting a long time, waiting in silence, and she was ready to uncover it. The weeks dragged on like a slow unraveling thread. For Eleanor Harland, each sunrise brought a deeper ache. The house she once shared with Thomas now felt like a mausoleum, quiet, orderly, and unbearably hollow. She stopped playing music in the mornings. She let the garden go untended. Meals went uneaten. Sometimes she would sit for hours in his favorite armchair, clutching his worn flannel shirt, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. Katie, meanwhile, had become a woman possessed. Her days were consumed by research, interviews, and nighttime visits to the cathedral. Her husband, Greg, had initially been supportive. But soon the late-night phone calls, the obsession with audio clips and blueprints, and her refusal to return to Chicago began eroding their marriage. One evening, after another long silence on the phone, Greg finally said, "Katie, I love your dad, but you're disappearing with him." She hung up without answering. At the precinct, Detective Marquez had grown weary. No new leads. No evidence of a crime. When Katie asked him to reopen the investigation based on the 1932 and 1956 cases, he shook his head. "Different eras, different contexts," he said. "And you're making leaps," she snapped. "You're not leaping enough." But she wasn't just angry. She was exhausted. Every wall she ran into pushed her further toward a conclusion no one wanted to hear. Something sacred was being protected, hidden, and it wasn't just about Thomas anymore. Her breakthrough came during a stormy Thursday evening. The cathedral was nearly empty when she slipped inside. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the stained glass windows. She walked to the Pietà, heart pounding, and sat alone in the pew beneath it. Her fingers clutched the rosary she'd taken from her father's bedside. She didn't expect anyone to speak, but someone did. An elderly priest sat quietly at the far end of the pew. He hadn't been there when she entered. His cassock was worn, his face sunken but kind. "You've been coming often," he said softly. Katie turned to him. "Do you know who I am?" He nodded. "The daughter, the one who listens." She hesitated, then whispered, "I think something took him. Not something evil, just ancient. Buried." The priest didn't look surprised. He gazed at the statue. "This place is older than its stones, built on memory, on longing. People think churches are full of answers. But mostly they're full of unanswered prayers." Katie studied him. "Did he come here that night?" "He came seeking release," the priest said. "As many do, but not everyone leaves once they've touched what they came for." Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" He didn't reply. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin, leather-bound notebook. Inside was a list, dates, names, handwritten notes. She recognized the name Francis Doyle and Delia Mendez, and one more name. Thomas Harland. The priest closed the book gently. "There are those who give themselves fully to prayer, so fully they don't return." Katie stood up, trembling. "Are you saying he's still here? Trapped?" The old man didn't meet her eyes. "I'm saying there are prayers that open doors, and once opened, not all wish to return to the world they left." When she turned to press him further, he was gone. Back home, Katie recounted the encounter to Eleanor. Her mother listened quietly, then for the first time in weeks stood and walked to the mantel. She lit a candle, placed her hands together and said, "I dreamed of him again." He was kneeling. His eyes were full of light. He said, "Don't mourn what hasn't ended." Katie sat down, overwhelmed. The cathedral had become a riddle, a sacred space where time blurred, where longing echoed louder than voices. The answers weren't in police files or camera feeds. They were in the stones, the shadows, the prayers left hanging in the air. And now, more than ever, Katie was certain. Her father hadn't left them behind. Not entirely. But if he was still there, somewhere behind those ancient walls, she would find him, even if it meant stepping into silence herself. 13 years passed. The world moved on, reshaping itself in the quiet way cities always do. New towers rose over Manhattan, old stores closed, children grew. Wars came and went, and still for Eleanor and Katie Harland, time remained fractured. A space once filled by a husband and father was still painfully vacant. Eleanor had long stopped asking questions. Her grief had cooled into quiet reverence. She lit a candle for Thomas every Sunday. Always the same seat, always the same prayer. Katie, now living alone in Brooklyn, had boxed most of her father's files. She still wore his dog tag under her blouse. The obsession had faded, but not the ache. Sometimes she caught herself walking past St. Patrick's without meaning to. A tether remained, unseen, unbroken. Then, in the spring of 2025, a restoration project began at the cathedral. A portion of the north transept was undergoing tile repairs, routine maintenance funded by private donors. Contractors worked slowly and respectfully, guided by preservationists. On a damp Wednesday morning, while removing aged tiles near the Pietà, one worker's hammer struck something beneath the stone, something that sounded different, It wasn't hollow, but it wasn't solid either. Curious, he removed another layer, revealing a thin pocket behind the marble. Inside, nestled in dust and time, was a single object, a rosary. Old, silver, worn down by decades of touch, its crucifix slightly bent, a single bead missing. The foreman, not knowing the significance, handed it over to the project lead, who passed it to the cathedral staff. By evening it sat quietly on the desk of Father Gregory Moran, the current head of the parish. That night, Father Moran flipped through archival photos of the Harland case. His eyes landed on an image, Thomas, sitting in the pew, rosary in hand. He enlarged the photo. Same crucifix, same bent bead, same broken loop. The next morning he called Eleanor. When she saw it, her legs gave way beneath her. She touched the beads like they were skin. Katie arrived an hour later, speechless. She examined the chain, the weight of it, the texture, the age. There was no doubt. This was her father's rosary. "How?" she whispered. No one had a good answer. The section where it was found had not been accessed in decades. The stonework was original, untouched since the 1800s. There was no recorded renovation in that area, not in 2012, not in any of the last 50 years. Forensic analysis confirmed the rosary had not been disturbed recently. It was coated in mineral dust, consistent with deep, enclosed stone environments. Yet it bore no damage, no signs of weather, water, or corrosion. It was as if it had been placed there, gently. The press latched on quickly. Rosary found behind cathedral wall reignites mystery of disappearance. The man who vanished in prayer, new clue emerges. Within days, the story went viral. News crews camped outside St. Patrick's. Blogs resurrected conspiracy theories. Some called it a miracle, others a cover-up. But beneath the noise, one truth remained. Something impossible had happened. Katie returned to the cathedral with the rosary in her palm. She sat beneath the pietà again, her breath shallow, heart racing. She didn't pray this time. She just listened. There was nothing, no whisper, no breath, but the air felt familiar. When she left the building, she didn't speak to reporters. She didn't write a statement. She simply held the beads close like a map she hadn't yet learned how to read. Eleanor, on the other hand, felt peace she hadn't touched in years. That night, she placed the rosary on her husband's pillow. She lit a candle and whispered, "Thank you." But Katie couldn't rest. The rosary hadn't survived 13 years behind stone by accident. Something had preserved it, or someone, and if that was true, if Thomas's rosary had waited all this time to be found, then maybe, just maybe, he was still waiting too, waiting beneath the stone, waiting in prayer. The rosary had changed everything. After the story broke, the archdiocese received hundreds of calls. Parishioners, historians, even skeptics demanded answers. But no one had more questions than Katie Harland. She began pressing for access to the exact site where the rosary was found. Initially, the cathedral staff resisted, citing structural risks and sanctity. But Katie didn't let go. She returned day after day, meeting with Father Moran, submitting formal requests, rallying support from the public. 3 weeks after the discovery, she was granted a narrow window. One day, supervised, accompanied by a restoration expert and a structural engineer. No digging, no intrusion, just observation. The team arrived early. The cathedral was quiet, sealed off from visitors. The pietà loomed above them like a sentinel as they examined the narrow cavity behind the removed tile. Flashlights revealed rough stonework, older than expected. Behind the gap, a faint seam in the wall's contour, almost like a door fused shut by time. The engineer confirmed something remarkable. "This section doesn't match the original blueprints," he said, tapping a stone with his knuckle. "There's air behind this wall, a pocket. Large, maybe 3 meters deep." Katie felt the breath leave her lungs. She stepped closer, resting her hand on the cool stone. The space felt still, but not empty. It felt quiet, like a silence with shape. The restoration expert, a woman named Dr. Amara Finch, had been skeptical. But as she traced the edges of the hidden structure, her tone changed. "This wasn't meant to be decorative," she said. "This was built to contain something." Within days, momentum grew. Dr. Finch wrote a proposal to explore the chamber with minimal disruption. Backed by public interest and media pressure, the Archdiocese reluctantly approved. The condition: no permanent alterations. A single, carefully cut access point would be permitted. 2 weeks later, under the supervision of both church and city officials, the team returned. The stonework was delicately breached. What they found behind it stopped everyone cold. A narrow passage led downward, stone steps worn with time, slick with condensation. The chamber was real, hidden, undocumented. At the base of the steps they found a sealed wooden door, blackened by age but intact. Symbols had been etched into its surface, crosses interlaced with Latin inscriptions. A small bronze plate read simply, "Silentium in Aeternum," silence forever. Father Moran paled when he read it. "This is pre-Vatican, older than anything in our records." Permission was granted to open it. Inside they found a vaulted room 12 feet across, circular. The walls were lined with faded murals, scenes of biblical anguish, prayer, penitence. In the center stood a simple stone altar, no dust, no decay, no signs of intrusion. It was as though time had stopped inside. Dr. Finch spoke softly. "This is a medieval sanctuary, a place for extreme seclusion. It shouldn't be here." Not in an American cathedral. No one could explain how it came to exist beneath St. Patrick's. There were no references in diocesan documents, no mention in architectural histories. It was an anomaly, silent, sacred, forgotten. But Katie didn't care about the structure. She cared about what it might still hold. As she examined the floor near the altar, she noticed something out of place, barely perceptible indentations in the dustless stone. She crouched. Her heart pounded. Marks, faint but deliberate. Letters, TH, her father's initials. Next to them, she found a scrap of paper, brittle but preserved. It had been wedged beneath a loose tile, nearly invisible. She opened it slowly. The handwriting was unmistakable. Thomas Harland. It read, "Prayer sustains. I do not fear the quiet. I only fear forgetting." Katie's hands shook. The world around her blurred. She looked up at the altar, then at the empty room. He had been here. 13 years. Somewhere behind the veil of stone he had written those words, maybe minutes after vanishing, maybe years. No one could say. But the message was clear. He hadn't left, and now she had proof. The vaulted chamber had no name, no records, no prayers offered on its behalf. It simply existed beneath the altar like a held breath, ancient and waiting. After the discovery of the initials and note, the exploration team grew cautious. What had begun as a structural investigation was now teetering into something else. Sacred, maybe, or unsettling. Katie couldn't stay away. She returned the next day, granted limited access again, this time with a flashlight, a notebook, and her father's rosary clasped tightly in her hand. Dr. Finch joined her, curious but hesitant. A second specialist, Joseph Leclerc, an archivist from the Archdiocese, came to document the inscriptions. They stepped into the chamber together. The air inside was dense and dry, unmoved by time. Dust did not settle here. The murals on the walls were clearer in daylight, depictions of isolation and devotion. A kneeling monk, cloaked in shadow, a weeping woman beneath a shattered bell, eyes lifted toward a sun that never shone. At the center of the chamber, the stone altar seemed untouched. No offerings, no candle wax. Just the smooth surface, and upon closer inspection, shallow grooves where hands might have rested for prayer. Katie moved toward the corner where she had found her father's note. Her eyes scanned the floor, walls, even the ceiling, hoping for more. Any sign that he had lingered longer. That's when Joseph noticed it. Another loose stone, this one near the mural of the cloaked monk. Carefully he removed it. Inside the crevice was a folded piece of parchment, thicker than the first. He handed it to Katie silently. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was a page from a notebook, lined, stained, The ink had faded, but the handwriting was hers to recognize. March 11th, 2013. They haven't found me yet. I don't know how time works down here. The bells don't ring. The air doesn't move. But I pray and I feel peace. The silence has a voice of its own. It isn't lonely, not always. It listens. I think God is near. If this is how I'm meant to stay, I accept it. But if she's still looking, tell Katie I remember her laughter. Tell Eleanor I still wear her ring. Katie sat down, legs buckling under her. Dr. Finch said nothing. Joseph quietly crossed himself. There was no blood, no sign of a body, no physical remains. But here, in handwriting that should have crumbled long ago, was undeniable evidence. Thomas Harland had not only been there, he had lived there. For how long? No one could say. Katie stood, breath shallow. The room felt different now, less cold, less unknown. That's when they heard it. A faint sound, barely perceptible, like a distant echo. Not mechanical, not from the street above. A murmur or a chant, rhythmic, soft. Joseph froze. Did you hear? Katie nodded. Yes. They followed the sound around the edge of the chamber. There, behind the altar's base, was another seam, narrower than the last, barely wide enough for a hand. From it the sound came again, muffled as if from a great distance, or another room sealed by time. No one spoke. Dr. Finch placed her palm on the wall, leaning close. It's real, she whispered. Katie pressed her ear to the stone. She couldn't make out words, just tone, like someone praying, like her father. She stepped back, overwhelmed. The air seemed to shimmer. Her mind swam with questions. How had he survived? Had he left? Was he still there? Or had he crossed into something beyond what any of them understood? There were no answers, only that sound, that echo. They sealed the chamber again that evening, leaving the stone door in place. But not before Katie placed her father's rosary back on the altar. It belonged there. Whatever had happened in that room, it wasn't horror, it wasn't abandonment. It was something else, something beyond comprehension. A life paused in reverence, a man lost in prayer, and maybe, just maybe, he was never lost at all. Katie didn't sleep that night. Her thoughts churned endlessly, her father's notes, the altar, the echoing murmur behind stone. Every moment she'd spent searching now felt like a prelude to this revelation. But it wasn't closure. Not yet. She had stood at the edge of something immense, faith, mystery, time itself, and felt the breath of it on her neck. The next morning she made a decision. If reason couldn't explain what had happened, perhaps something older than reason could. She reached out to Claire Bonaventure, a woman known among spiritual communities as a listener. Not a medium in the conventional sense, but a sensitive with a reputation for presence. Katie didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in patterns, and she was desperate. Claire met her outside the cathedral on a quiet Friday afternoon. She was calm, serene, dressed plainly, no theatrics. No incense or props. Katie explained the story, her father's disappearance, the chamber, the notes. Claire listened without judgment. Inside, they sat beneath the pietà, the rosary back in Katie's hands. Claire closed her eyes. For a long time she said nothing. Then she whispered, "He's not gone, he's in between." Katie's breath caught. "He chose silence," Claire continued. "He gave himself fully. What you found wasn't an accident. That space, it listens and sometimes it answers." "Answers what?" Katie asked. Claire opened her eyes. "The question beneath all prayers, am I alone?" Katie swallowed hard. "Do you hear him?" Claire shook her head. "No. But I feel what he left behind. It's not despair. It's devotion. That's rare." Later that evening, Katie told Eleanor everything. They sat side by side in silence. Then Eleanor said, "I used to think grief was about what we lost, but maybe it's about what we're still connected to." She rose and fetched something from a box in the closet, her old journal. Flipping through pages, she stopped at a dated entry, October 2015. Katie watched her mother's eyes scan the page, then blink slowly. "I wrote this the night I dreamed of him kneeling," Eleanor said. "I remember because it felt different, like I didn't want to wake up." She handed the journal to Katie. In the entry, Eleanor had described a dream where Thomas was bathed in light, surrounded by shadowed stone. He held his rosary and looked up at her with calm eyes. "I'm not gone," he had said. "Just in prayer." Katie's hands trembled as she read. Had her father truly found a space between worlds, where prayer suspended time, where silence kept him alive? It defied understanding, but the dream matched the room, the mural, even the words in his letter. Later, Katie met again with Joseph Leclerc to ask about the symbols on the chamber door, crosses interwoven with circles. Latin etched faintly above. He consulted a theological archive and came back 2 days later with a theory. "They resemble marks from the Devotio Silentium," he said, a 14th century order of monks who believed in sacred isolation, that silence itself could be a path to divine communion. He paused. "They built vaults like this across Europe. Most were destroyed or lost, but their symbols match what we found." Katie stared at him. "You're saying that someone built that room for people to disappear into prayer?" "Not disappear," Joseph said. "Transform. They believed God spoke in silence. The longer you stayed, the louder he became." Back at the cathedral, Katie sat again in the pew. Her father's rosary felt warm in her hand. She stared at the altar, the stone, the shadows. For the first time, she didn't feel grief. She felt awe, not fear, not even sadness, just reverence for a man who had walked into silence and chosen to remain, not because he was lost, but because he had found something the world couldn't give him. The space hadn't trapped him. He had become part of it, and maybe in a way she didn't yet fully understand, it had become part of her. The Vatican arrived quietly. No press conferences, no grand procession. Just 3 men in dark coats arriving in a black sedan and ushered through a side entrance of St. Patrick's before the morning Mass. Their presence was not announced, but it was noticed. They moved with precision, carrying slim black folders and speaking only to a select few. Katie recognized them instantly, not by name but by demeanor. They were investigators, not tourists, men accustomed to secrets. One of them, a middle-aged cleric with pale eyes, introduced himself to Father Moran as Monsignor Rinaldi. He spoke 5 languages, including silence. He asked for access to the chamber beneath the altar. At first, Father Moran hesitated, but the church had spoken. And so the door was opened again. Katie was not invited. From a distance, she watched as the Vatican team descended into the crypt. They stayed nearly 3 hours. When they emerged, their expressions were unreadable. Rinaldi spoke with no one, except for a brief nod to Joseph Leclerc. Then they left just as quietly as they had come. By nightfall, rumors spread through the cathedral staff. The chamber would be sealed permanently. The area would be restricted. No public access, no further studies. Katie confronted Father Moran that evening. "They want to bury it," she said. He looked exhausted. "They want to preserve the sanctity of the cathedral, and perhaps protect those who can't bear what they might find. But my father," he raised a hand gently, "I believe you, Katie, but belief and permission are not the same." The next morning, a metal gate was installed at the base of the transept steps. A velvet rope stretched across the opening. A sign read, "Access restricted. Restoration underway." It felt like erasure. But Katie wasn't the only one disturbed. Joseph had begun receiving anonymous emails. One contained scans of pages from a Vatican-bound manuscript, Tractatus de locis inter sanctum et mundum, treatise on the places between the sacred and the world. It referenced spiritual sanctuaries constructed beneath holy sites, meant for extreme contemplative isolation. A marginal note read, "Only the devout may enter without being undone." Another email arrived days later. No words, just a photo of a chamber in Prague, eerily similar to the one beneath St. Patrick's. Same mural patterns, same stone altar. Someone was watching. The idea that the chamber beneath the cathedral was part of a hidden tradition unsettled Katie deeply. These were not random constructions. They were intentional, designed for retreat, reflection, or something else, and they were meant to remain hidden. That secrecy now extended to her. Her interviews were suddenly cancelled. Journalists who once begged for comment stopped returning calls. Even Dr. Finch, once eager to publish their findings, now refused to speak on record. The message was clear: stop. But Katie didn't stop. She turned to the one thing the church couldn't censor: her father's words. She reread the letters, the dates, the final phrases, and something began to form, a pattern in his sentences, an acrostic. The first letters of each note spelled out a verse, Psalm 91. She flipped open her old Bible. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. It hit her like a wave. Her father hadn't only found silence, he had found sanctuary, not metaphorical, literal, built stone by stone for those who sought to vanish from the noise of the world, and he had willingly stepped into it, not as a victim, as a pilgrim. Katie stood at the gates one last time. She gripped the rosary that had once rested beneath that ancient stone and whispered, "I understand now." Behind her, the cathedral was filled with the low hum of prayer, incense curling upward like breath from the bones of the building. It was still a church, but now she knew it was more than that. It was a threshold, and some doors aren't meant to be opened, not because they hide danger, but because they guard devotion. Katie Harland couldn't let it end there. The rosary, the notes, the hidden chamber, they had given her pieces of her father. But not the whole, not the final moment. She needed more than signs. She needed to stand where he stood, to feel what he felt, to know, not just believe, that he had chosen the silence. And so, one early morning before the cathedral opened, she slipped inside unnoticed. She knew the routine. The janitor would be making rounds near the sacristy. The priest wouldn't appear for another 45 minutes. She moved with practiced precision, bypassing the velvet rope and ducking beneath the gate. Her steps were silent on the stone stairs. The air changed instantly, cooler, still. At the bottom of the stairs she reached the sealed door, but it wasn't locked. Someone, perhaps Joseph, perhaps no one, had left it slightly ajar. Katie didn't hesitate. She descended into the chamber one last time. The room was exactly as she remembered it. Murals faded but watching. Altar still as bone. The air held that impossible heavy stillness. The moment she crossed the threshold, the world above ceased to matter. Her breath slowed. She moved to the altar, her father's rosary in her hand. She placed it gently in the center, then stepped back. And then it happened. The chamber dimmed, not in light, but in perception. Her vision narrowed. A wave of heat passed through her chest. Her knees weakened, and she saw him, Thomas Harland. Not a memory, not a ghost. A vision that gripped the chamber with such clarity it robbed her of breath. He was kneeling at the altar, eyes closed, hands resting lightly on the stone. He looked older, thinner, but peaceful. His lips moved in prayer, silent and steady. Katie's heart pounded. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. The image flickered. She blinked, and he turned his head. He didn't smile, but his eyes met hers, eyes filled with a kind of luminous serenity she had never seen in life. Not resignation, not distance, presence. He opened his mouth, and though no sound emerged, she felt the words, "You found me." Then everything went black. She collapsed. When she awoke, she was outside the chamber door, lying on the cold stone floor. Her limbs ached. Her mouth was dry. But the rosary was gone, and the chamber was sealed. She crawled to her feet, disoriented but calm. Something had happened, not imagined, not dreamed, felt. Later that morning, Joseph found her sitting at the cathedral steps, staring up at the towering spires. She looked like someone who had returned from a place words couldn't describe. "You went in," he said softly. She nodded. "I saw him." He sat beside her, saying nothing. Katie turned to him. It wasn't haunting, it wasn't loss, it was devotion made real, like prayer had weight, form. He didn't leave the world. He stepped deeper into it. Joseph didn't ask questions. He only listened. She rested her head in her hands, overwhelmed but at peace. For the first time since that October night 13 years earlier, she didn't feel absence. She felt presence, real and quiet and eternal. Later, she tried to describe the experience to Eleanor, but her mother didn't need details. She looked into her daughter's eyes and said, "You found where he went." Katie whispered, "He's still praying." Eleanor smiled. "Then so will I." The Harland home changed after that, not dramatically, just enough. The candle on the mantel burned more steadily. The silence in the rooms felt comforting instead of cold. Grief had finally transformed into something gentler. As for Katie, she never returned to the chamber. She didn't need to. The image of her father remained, not in photographs, not in headlines, but in the space between breaths, in the stillness between words, in the act of faith itself. She had stepped between light and stone, and there, in that liminal space, she had met him again. Katie kept the experience to herself for a while. What she had seen, what she had felt, wasn't something easily explained. The rational world had no space for visions, but something inside her had shifted, and it demanded to be heard. She sat at her desk that night, opened a blank notebook, and began writing, freehand as though guided, not a memory, not an account, but a recollection of sensation. She wrote what she had felt in the chamber, what she had heard without hearing, Psalm 91, not just the text, the rhythm, the voice. She closed her eyes and whispered it aloud, and as she did, she felt the room still around her. Later, she played the audio from the small recorder she'd worn into the crypt, though she hadn't remembered turning it on. For the first 20 minutes, there was nothing. Then faintly a breath. Then a voice. She froze. The voice wasn't hers. And it wasn't the silence of the chamber. It was low, deliberate, and unmistakably his. Thomas Harland reciting, "He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge." Katie listened to it again. Then again. Each time her throat tightened. It was not a recording from 13 years ago. It was new. It had been captured during her final visit, when she collapsed outside the sealed door. He was praying. Still. She shared the audio with Joseph, who ran it through software to test for tampering, layering, duplication. The waveforms were pure, no signs of stitching. One unbroken voice, recorded in real time. Joseph sat back in stunned silence. "There's no explanation," he said, "not one I can offer." Katie released the clip anonymously online. It spread like wildfire. Forums debated it furiously. Some claimed it was AI-generated. Others believed it was a hoax. But then linguists stepped in, experts in voice pattern aging. One declared that the voice matched Thomas Harland's public recordings with uncanny precision, but aged 13 years. Skeptics rejected the idea. Faithful listeners called it a miracle. Church officials remained silent. The divide between belief and doubt became sharp. To some, Katie was exploiting grief. To others, she was a modern-day witness to the sacred. But she never responded to the noise. Instead, she sat again with her mother, playing the voice through a speaker. Eleanor cried, not with sorrow, but with awe. "It's him," she whispered. "He's still speaking. Just not in our time." The phrase stuck with Katie. Not in our time. Maybe time inside the sanctuary didn't pass as it did in the world above. Maybe silence distorted it, or maybe faith had created a bridge where Thomas remained, not as a ghost, but as a soul still in communion. She took the audio to the priest who'd first spoken to her long ago, the one who had given her the names in the notebook, Father Abel, now retired. He listened in silence, head bowed. When it ended, he made the sign of the cross. "You've entered something sacred," he said, "and dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Katie asked. "Because it doesn't ask for proof. It asks for surrender." She left his home shaken, but not fearful. She understood now that the experience wasn't meant to convert or convince. It was meant to remain intimate between her and the one who had chosen the stillness. A few days later, a stranger approached her outside the cathedral, a middle-aged woman with quiet eyes. "I heard the voice," she said. "My husband disappeared 10 years ago. Same way. Different city. A basilica in Milan." Katie didn't know what to say. The woman smiled. "He was praying when he vanished, I believe you." That single sentence unraveled something new. Maybe Thomas wasn't the only one. Maybe the chamber beneath St. Patrick's wasn't an exception, but part of a hidden order, still functioning, still listening. Katie didn't pursue the theory. Not yet. Because for now she had something more valuable. She had her father's voice, not as memory, as presence. And in that whispered psalm captured through stone, she found the answer to a question that had haunted her for 13 years. He was never gone. He had only gone deeper. The rosary returned once more. Katie placed it carefully back in the stone chamber beneath the altar, right where her father's hands had once pressed it into place. This time, there was no ceremony, no cameras, just quiet. Reverent, like the act itself was a continuation of a conversation whispered across years. She had debated keeping it. But deep down, she knew it belonged there. It wasn't an artifact. It was a thread, a living link between past and presence, between prayer and permanence. When she stood to leave, the air shifted. Nothing dramatic, just a change in pressure, the feeling of being acknowledged. Later that night, she played the audio recording again, the one where his voice had been captured beneath the stone. This time she noticed something different, something barely audible near the end. A whisper, just one line. She enhanced the audio, played it back slowly. Thomas's voice, soft and unmistakable, saying, "Faith is not bound by time." It wasn't part of Psalm 91, it was something else, something he had said, or meant to say, or wanted her to know. Katie sat in stunned silence. It wasn't just a message. It was permission. He had made peace with his silence. And now so could she. Days passed. The cathedral returned to its rhythms. Tourists came and went. Services were held, confessions spoken, but to Katie, it all felt different now. Like a deeper heartbeat pulsed beneath the marble floors. Eleanor returned with her. They sat side by side, their hands clasped. They didn't speak. Before they left, Eleanor rose and walked to the Pietà. She lit a candle and placed it beside the others. Then she whispered something no one else could hear. "Wait for us." Katie watched as her mother smiled, not a sad smile, but a whole one. Like something closed finally in her heart. Outside, the city moved as it always had, but inside a silence endured. Not the absence of sound, the fullness of it. That same week, Katie received an invitation from a small press. They had read her anonymous articles and the forums where she had responded carefully, always guarded. They asked if she would consider telling the whole story. Not a documentary, not an exposé, a book. She agreed. She called it The Man Who Never Left. In it, she didn't try to prove anything. She didn't argue theology or chase explanation. She simply told what happened. Her father's routine, his disappearance, the search, the chamber, the voice, the feeling, and the silence that gave everything meaning. The book quietly gained attention. Readers wrote to her with stories of their own, people who had experienced something similar but never spoken of it, names etched on stone. Voices heard in dreams, sacred spaces that bent time around grief. Katie answered every letter, not with solutions, but with presence. She had learned that sometimes the greatest comfort wasn't an answer, it was being heard in the dark, and her father had heard her. One evening, a teenager approached her outside the cathedral. She looked nervous, clutching a printout of the final page of the book. "I read it 4 times, she said. "It made me feel like maybe some prayers aren't lost." Katie smiled. "They never are. Sometimes they just take a while to return." The girl handed her a small envelope. Inside was a paper rosary, carefully folded. "I made it," she whispered. You said he liked to pray. Katie accepted it gently. He still does. As the sun dipped behind the towers of the city, Katie walked slowly down Fifth Avenue. The cathedral behind her glowed in the fading light, like a lighthouse for the unseen. And somewhere, deep beneath its stone bones, a silence held steady. A sanctuary kept alive by faith, by love, by the power of memory prayed aloud. Thomas Harlan's name had not faded. It had become a benediction, and in the hush between words his voice still whispered, timeless, unbroken, remembered. In the months that followed the book's release, St. Patrick's Cathedral became more than a landmark. It became a threshold. Pilgrims arrived not to gawk at stained glass or snap photos, but to sit, quietly, prayerfully, in the pews. Many came with rosaries in their pockets. Some left notes tucked behind candles, others whispered names of those they had lost. No official statement ever came from the church about the chamber. The metal gate remained, but the faithful knew. Katie returned often, though never again to the crypt. That door had been opened enough. Now it was time to let the silence speak. She watched as people lingered longer near the Pietà. She heard stories from strangers, loved ones who had vanished, not physically but emotionally, and how something in the story of Thomas Harlan gave them courage to believe they hadn't truly lost them. It wasn't just a mystery anymore, it was communion. One afternoon, as Katie walked past the rear pews, an elderly man nodded to her. "May I ask something?" he said gently. She stopped. "Of course. That voice in the recording, did it really come from him?" She paused, then answered, "It came from where he still is." The man nodded, his eyes moist. "That's all I needed to know." Katie sat in the pew after he left, staring at the ceiling's high arches. So many had prayed beneath them, some begging for miracles, some seeking comfort. Some, like her father, simply offering themselves without expectation. She closed her eyes and breathed in the quiet, and in that stillness she heard something faint, a footstep, not hers, not near, just a soft shift of weight, far behind her. She turned, heart thudding. No one, but the sound had been real. The next day, a visiting seminarian reported hearing whispering in Latin from beneath the transept floor, though no one else was present. Another woman, seated near the altar, claimed she felt her shawl brush forward, as if someone had walked past her gently, though the pews were empty. Father Moran received these reports with grace and caution. He made no public comments. But when Katie asked him how often he heard them now, he gave her a weary smile. Enough to know something was never sealed. Joseph Leclerc continued his quiet research. He compiled testimonies, sightings, fragments of ancient liturgy. He kept it private, but once a month he sent Katie a single line from his findings. One read, "Sanctum silentium non est vacuum." Holy silence is not empty. Katie kept each line in a small journal titled Traces. Despite the deep reverence surrounding the story, not everyone believed. Critics labeled it myth-making. Some called it psychological projection. A few accused the church of manipulating sentiment for renewed devotion. But the accusations faded, because the silence didn't. It continued, undeniable, inexplicable. It echoed in ways not even doubt could erase. The cathedral custodians began reporting candles that stayed lit longer than their wax allowed. Choir members noticed harmonies holding slightly beyond their breath. And on the 13th anniversary of Thomas Harlan's disappearance, a man lighting a candle for his sister claimed he heard a voice murmur, "Peace is in the staying." He didn't tell the press. He told Katie. She believed him. She continued to write. Not for headlines, but for those who had questions they didn't know how to ask. Her next book was titled In the Stillness, Finding Faith Where the World Stops. It wasn't about answers. It was about what remained when answers fell away. One night, Eleanor visited the cathedral alone. She stayed after closing with special permission. She brought no flowers, no camera, just herself and a memory. She walked to the side altar, lit a single candle, then whispered, "I forgive time for moving on." She sat quietly for an hour. and when she rose, she felt lighter. She never spoke of what she saw that night, but when Katie asked her how it felt, Eleanor simply said, "Like he's still right behind me." That was all Katie needed to hear, because in the end, some echoes aren't meant to fade, they're meant to remain. Katie Harland sat in the pew, rosary in hand, the weight of 13 years gently coiled between her fingers. The cathedral glowed in the amber hush of late afternoon, each shaft of light catching motes of dust like suspended prayers. Around her, the city throbbed with its usual pulse, but here time bent differently. She didn't need to descend into the stone chamber again. She didn't need more signs or voices. This was her father's church now, not just in memory, but in spirit, in presence. And she had learned to live with both. She closed her eyes and whispered the prayer he had loved most. Not loudly, just enough for the silence to catch it. "He will cover you with his feathers." The words wrapped around her, soft and familiar. Across the cathedral, a family lit candles for a grandfather lost to dementia. A teenager wiped tears from her eyes while writing in a journal. An older man clutched a weathered rosary and knelt in a posture of practiced reverence. Thomas Harland wasn't the only soul who had vanished into devotion, but he was one of the few who had taught others how to listen for what lingers after someone is gone. Katie opened her journal and wrote one final line beneath the others. "Amen is not the end, it's the invitation to begin again." She stood, tucked the rosary into her coat, and walked slowly down the central aisle, her steps even and unhurried. The choir was beginning to warm up behind the altar. The organ hummed its opening chords. People filtered in, strangers, faithful, seekers. Some of them had read her book, some had heard the recording, some had only heard rumors. All of them had come for something more than proof. Outside, the city buzzed, horns, footsteps, lives spinning forward. Inside, the stillness held. Before exiting, Katie turned one last time toward the Pietà. She smiled, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Because even now, years after he knelt for the final time, her father was still there. Not locked behind stone, not lost in mystery, just present, in the hush, in the pause, in the unspoken prayer at the edge of sound, and as long as people still came to listen, he would never be forgotten. If you've made it this far, thank you. Stories like this remind us that faith, mystery, and love are not bound by time or space. If this journey moved you, helped you see something differently, or simply made you pause, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that reach beyond the obvious, that echo where the world forgets to listen. And before you go, we've selected another incredible mystery for you, one that unfolds where logic stops and something else takes over. Click on the video on your screen now to follow the next story, and keep listening. Because sometimes the truth isn't loud, it's waiting in silence.